It was an ordinary night, the kind that slips between days unnoticed. The house was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. A dim glow from the streetlights seeped through the curtains, casting faint, swaying shadows across the floor. My uncle lay on the couch, as he often did, his breathing slow and measured. He was a man of habit, early to rise, late to rest, always carrying an air of quiet detachment. He never talked much, but when he did, his words carried weight. I had spent countless evenings in his presence, listening to the stories he chose to tell and wondering about the ones he kept to himself. Tonight was different, though I couldn't quite say why. He had fallen asleep earlier than usual, his body sinking deep into the worn-out cushions. His left arm dangled over the side of the couch, fingers curled slightly, unmoving. His chest rose and fell, but something about the rhythm unsettled me. I sat across from him, flipping through an old book I had no real intention of reading. My eyes kept drifting from the yellowed pages to his still form. It was strange how quiet the house felt. Not just the usual kind of quiet, but something deeper, heavier. A silence that pressed against the walls and settled into the corners. The air felt thick, dense in a way I couldn't explain. I tried to shake off the feeling, blaming it on exhaustion. Maybe I was overthinking. Maybe I had been spending too much time alone. Still, I found myself watching him. A part of me wanted to call his name, to wake him, just to hear his voice and confirm that everything was as it should be. But that felt ridiculous. He was only sleeping. What reason did I have to disturb him? The clock ticked on. The shadows swayed. The feeling didn't leave. I closed my book and stood, stretching the stiffness from my limbs. Maybe a glass of water would help clear my mind. I moved toward the kitchen, forcing myself to look away from him. Just as I reached the doorway, something stopped me. It wasn't a sound, not exactly. More like the absence of one. I turned back. The house had not changed. My uncle had not moved. But for the first time, I noticed something odd. His chest. It was no longer rising and falling. I froze. My pulse quickened, my ears straining for any sign of breath. A trick of the light, I told myself. A trick of my tired mind. But the silence stretched on. He was too still. Too quiet. I took a step closer, then another, my breath catching in my throat. Uncle. No response. I hesitated. Then, with growing unease, I reached out a hand. And just before my fingers touched his shoulder, the clock stopped ticking. My fingers hovered just above his shoulder, a breath away from contact. The air around me felt different, thicker, almost oppressive, as if the room itself were holding its breath. The silence stretched. The clock had stopped. I hadn't noticed the exact moment it happened, but now the absence of its steady ticking rang louder than any sound could. I swallowed hard, willing myself to stay rational. A power surge, maybe? A coincidence? Something explainable? My uncle was still lying there, unmoving. His face was slack, almost too relaxed. His skin, which usually held the warmth of someone deep in rest, looked off. A shade too pale. A fraction too still. I forced myself to shake his shoulder. Gently at first. Then harder. Uncle. My voice came out quieter than I intended. Hey, wake up. Nothing. A flicker of unease twisted in my stomach. I leaned closer, my pulse quickening. I hadn't noticed before, but the temperature in the room had dropped. A shiver crawled down my spine. I pressed my fingers against his wrist, searching for a pulse. Cold. His skin was cold. I yanked my hand back, my heart thudding against my ribs. That didn't make sense. The room wasn't that cold. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe he was just in an unusually deep sleep. But deep sleep didn't explain the way his chest remained eerily still. I leaned in, hesitating, before lowering my ear near his mouth. My breath caught as I strained to hear anything. A whisper of air. The faintest inhale. Nothing. My body went rigid. No. That wasn't possible. I stumbled back a step, my mind racing. Maybe I should call someone. Maybe I was overreacting. But what if I wasn't? What if? A sound. Soft. Almost imperceptible. I froze. My eyes snapped back to my uncle's face. Had I imagined it? Then again. A whisper of movement. A shift, barely there. His lips, once slack and unmoving, twitched. I exhaled shakily, relief flooding my chest. He was waking up. Maybe he had just been in a deep, unnatural sleep. Maybe. His eyes opened. My breath hitched. For a moment, I felt nothing but pure relief. Then I saw them. His pupils wrong. Not adjusting to the dim light, not even focusing on me. They were wide, impossibly dark, swallowing every ounce of color from his irises.
He wasn't looking at me.
He was looking through me. The room suddenly felt suffocating. Every instinct screamed at me to move, to turn away, to leave. But I couldn't, because at that moment, for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure my uncle was the one looking back at me. My uncle's eyes, if they were even his, remained locked on me, black and endless, absorbing every sliver of light in the room. He didn't blink. He didn't shift. He just stared. A primal instinct stirred in my chest, something older than reason, something that screamed run. But I couldn't. My body refused to obey, as if some unseen force had pinned me in place. The air in the room felt wrong, thicker, heavier, like wading through water. A pressure built behind my ears, a deep, thrumming sensation that I couldn't place. The silence was no longer just the absence of sound. It was something else, something living, pressing into my skull like invisible hands. Then my uncle moved. It wasn't natural. Not the slow, sluggish stirrings of someone waking from deep sleep, nor the confused shifts of a groggy man. It was too smooth, too controlled. His body unfolded, one limb at a time, deliberate and measured, as if testing the limits of movement. My breath caught. "Uncle." My voice barely rose above a whisper. He didn't answer. Instead, his lips parted and a sound escaped. Not words, not a sigh, but something closer to a breathy click. A noise that didn't belong in a human throat. The room felt smaller. The walls seemed to close in. My pulse hammered against my ribs. This wasn't sleep paralysis. Wasn't a bad dream.
I knew that now.
I took a shaky step back. His head tilted ever so slightly. The movement was eerily precise, almost curious, like he was studying me. Then he smiled. A slow, deliberate stretch of lips, revealing teeth that looked just a fraction too sharp. Every hair on my body stood on end. I reached for my phone, fingers fumbling. My mind raced. Who do I call? The hospital? The police?
I didn't even know what I'd say.
Something is wrong with my uncle? His eyes aren't right. He's smiling at me like he knows something I don't. The pressure in the room deepened. My vision wavered. I blinked just once. And in that fraction of a second, he was standing, right in front of me. My breath seized. I hadn't seen him move. Hadn't heard a shift of fabric or a creak of the floorboards. One moment he was on the couch. The next he was here. Inches away. Close enough that I could feel his breath, or something, ghosting against my skin. The smile never faltered. I did the only thing I could. I ran. Stumbling, nearly tripping over my own feet, I bolted for the door, my heart slamming against my ribs. My uncle, or whatever he had become, didn't follow. But just as my fingers closed around the doorknob, I heard his voice in my back.
Soft.
Almost amused. "Why are you afraid?" The question slithered through the air, soft and almost amused, yet it sent a cold spike of terror down my spine.
I didn't turn around.
I couldn't. My trembling fingers fumbled with the lock, the metal slippery under my grip. The air behind me felt thick, charged, like the moment before a thunderclap. I knew, without seeing, that my uncle was still standing there, too close, too still. Watching. This isn't real. This isn't real. I whispered it like a prayer, like repetition could make it true. The lock clicked open. I yanked the door wide and stumbled into the night, lungs heaving. The air outside was sharp, cool, but it did nothing to ease the suffocating dread clinging to my skin. The street was empty, silent, too silent. No distant hum of cars, no rustling leaves. Just stillness. I took a shaky step forward. Then another. My mind raced. Where do I go?
Who do I call?
Then, Lewis. I froze. My mother's voice. Soft questioning. I turned. She stood just beyond the porch light's reach, her expression puzzled. She was dressed in her nightclothes, a robe wrapped loosely around her frame. Behind her, the house remained exactly as it had been. Dimly lit, quiet. Normal. My lips parted, but no words came. She frowned. What are you doing out here? I opened my mouth, then hesitated. How could I explain? Uncle wasn't uncle? His eyes were wrong. He moved without moving? The words felt ridiculous. I swallowed hard. Where's Uncle? My voice was hoarse. She blinked. Asleep. On the couch. Where else would he be? A chill spread through me. I turned slowly, hesitantly. Through the open doorway, I could see into the living room. The couch. The dim glow of the lamp. And there, my uncle, lying exactly as he had been before. One arm draped over the couch's edge, his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. Sleeping, like nothing had ever happened. The world tilted. My vision swam. No, I whispered. That's not. But the words died in my throat. Because then, his eyes opened. Not the black, endless voids from before. Just his usual tired, half-lidded gaze. His brows furrowed slightly as he groggily turned his head toward me. What's going on? His voice was rough with sleep. Normal. Completely normal. I stared, my pulse a violent drum in my ears. My mother sighed, rubbing her temples. Lewis, you're scaring me. Come inside. I should have. I should have let it go. But as I stepped forward, as I crossed the threshold, I caught it, the faintest twitch at the corner of my uncle's lips. A smile.
Small.
Barely there. Like a secret only he understood.